Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbo Rohaj. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friend Julia Joja, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and teaches at Georgetown and George Washington universities. Our special guest today is Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, a member of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada from European Solidarity Party and chair of the Verkhovna Rada's European Integration Committee. On our podcast, we discuss security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. I suppose one important news item that's been discussed for quite some time has been the question of the use of Western missiles, especially ATACMS and Storm Shadows, to hit targets deep inside of Russia. The British UK's Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, was in Washington on Friday to discuss this topic with President Biden. And like in previous iterations of similar debates about what Ukraine can or can't be allowed to do, we seem to be moving towards a resolution in which we'll abandon our previously held red line and let Ukraine do as they please. But it will again be too little, too late. Is this just me or is this an assessment that you, Julia, share as well?
I think it's an assessment that I share, and this time actually President Putin shares too, because he has ventured the same kinds of threats and blackmail as he has now, I think, in 5, if not close to 10 iterations from delivering the first javelins all the way to what we have now. And I think it's also striking in this context how we talk about these permissions that are increasingly divorced from the principles of international law. It's very clear, and it has been from the beginning, that Ukraine has the right to defend itself, including on all of Russian territory. And it has been clear now for a while that Ukraine has used its own very limited means to strike deep inside Russia when it could. The additional factor here is that we talk about this possibility of provocation or escalation, but the range would not permit technically Ukraine to hit the capital city, Moscow or St. Petersburg. So it's just about increasing a little bit the range to be able to hit some of the bases from which fighters and missiles are being launched at Ukraine, certainly not all of them. And one more thing that I think is important to add here, based on the recent interview of Fareed Zakaria from CNN with President Zelensky of Ukraine, is Zelensky mentions this too. Zakaria asked about the range and he says, he doesn't say too little too late because he's being polite, but he says, but already Russia has been adapting. Already they have moved things beyond this line into the 500 kilometer range that we will not be able to hit. So after this is being approved, if this is being permitted by the United States and its allies, then we will eventually have to ask for even more, for a longer range, because of course the Russians are adapting. It's not about greed. It's about us coping, like you said, Dalibor, too little, too late with the war. And then one more thing to throw out there as we're moving into the next topic, it also does not help and increasingly kind of sends a message to the Russians about our disunity that we've seen Chancellor Scholz going out there in the last few days and saying, even if the United States permits the widening of the range, I will not permit this with the Taurus missiles. It does not help, and it sends a clear message to Putin that we still have not decided how we want to conduct this war and how we want to support Ukraine.
So I have two things to say about the topic. So I'm struck by how many people in the West are still falling for these Russian threats, right? So President Putin said that if this permission is granted, then the West will be at war with Russia, as if that were not something that had been asserted hundreds times before. And you saw Bridge Colby retweeting this and adding his line saying, we'd better listen to what President Putin has to say about this. The whole thing is so ludicrous, and I think sort of signals just the sort of lack of learning in some quarters. I mean, you could argue, I guess the most charitable reading of this is that, the fact that the Russians bluffed before does not necessarily prove that they are bluffing now, and at some point they might want to uphold whatever their red lines are, which is fine. I mean, let them do it, right? Like, it's like we can't really live in this constant fear of escalation, because that means that Russia will win, even though it's a much lesser power than the sort of combined force of the West. It's just striking to me that this is what passes as strategy in Washington these days. And then the second aspect of it is that it is really unhelpful that before this permission is granted, we are having a 2-month conversation about it, which enables Russia to adapt exactly the way you described. And then one day permission will be granted and they'll strike the targets, and then everybody will be sort of underwhelmed by what the Ukraine is able to achieve with this greater range. And it speaks to me to the sort of, Ukrainians are, like, we are having this conversation for a reason, which is that the West is unwilling to grant the permission, and Ukrainians have to sort of build up political pressure, mobilize public opinion, have lots of, like Lithuanians and Estonians knocking on doors in Congress and elsewhere, making the case for why this is important. And that simply means that, I mean, a lot of these sort of expressions of support for Ukraine from DC, from Westminster, from Berlin are just so hollow. Like, we are trying to really get away with doing the bare minimum necessary, and we've been trying to do that since the beginning of the war. And there's always this sort of heavy lifting involved in every tiny baby step that the West takes, and that just really doesn't bode very well for how this war is going to end.
And I'm afraid, just to add a little bit to it, and this is a theme that we keep picking up, but we can't escape, is that in the end, what we're doing is not just complete lack of strategy and that it is ridiculous, but also that we are increasing our costs all the time. With every hesitation, we are enabling the Russians to adapt and hence increase the cost on us. How many pieces of drones have now fallen from Russia on NATO territory, and how much cost does that add just by having to mobilize fighter jets, just to give one example. And Russia is increasing the cost on us and probing our red lines while threatening us with their red lines all the time. Over the past week, it almost goes unnoticed in the news. Russia has now attacked the first time a civilian ship transporting grain through the Black Sea, out of the Black Sea, for food security in the exclusive economic zone of Romania. The ship had to seek refuge in a Romanian, so NATO port. We almost do not notice it anymore, and instead we're talking about, and I guess this is a good segue into the other topic, how much Russia's partners and allies are aiding. We have now the confirmation after months that ballistic missiles are being delivered from Iran to Russia and will soon hit Ukraine. This is something that we knew was coming. We had been warning Russia and Iran excessively. Now it's on to the operational theater. How much cost will that incur for us, including in missile defense that we're delivering to Ukraine when we could have prevented it? And now we're looking onto the reality of China. Isn't that the biggest news of the week? China delivering now confirmed not just dual use, surprise, surprise, but is fueling directly Russia's war machine. So, Dalibor, any thoughts on how we should be looking at this piece of news?
It's interesting, isn't it? So at the same time, Chancellor Scholz is in Samarkand speaking to Central Asian leaders, and apparently the big topic with Uzbekistan is migration and repatriating Uzbek nationals in Germany and opening up German labor market to highly qualified Uzbeks, which, that's a fine topic. I understand the sort of domestic political salience of it, but obviously these countries sort of wedged between China and Russia have been important entry points for sanction evasion and getting stuff into Russia, and I think that should be the sort of top priority for any European leader who goes to these parts of the world. Yet from Germany we sort of hear these mixed signals about China. So last week or week before, the Spanish Prime Minister who visited China basically pushed against the idea of imposing tariffs on Chinese EV exports to the EU, and the German government seems to have been backing this notion. It's again sort of signaling, I'm not a protectionist. It's a delicate subject matter. I don't think it's a sort of foregone conclusion that we should be sort of slapping tariffs on Chinese EV exports as Europeans. A reasonable case can be made for it, but it's complicated. But the fact that we are sort of signaling our weakness and unwillingness to do things, even though we have prima facie evidence of the Chinese behaving in a way that's just not congruent with our interest, whether it's buying huge amounts of Russian Russian oil, whether it's basically turning a blind eye to networks of companies that circumvent sanctions. And we always play this game of whack-a-mole, like going after individual companies and trying to slap sanctions on them, whether it's for semiconductors or dual-use stuff, whereas the Chinese are just kind of shrugging their shoulders and thinking elsewhere. Like, we should be able to escalate, right? Like, it's a little bit like shooting, individual Russian missiles with like $3 million anti-air systems, as opposed to going after the source of those missiles. And so Europeans and Americans, for that matter, have been just singularly ineffectual in dealing with this. So 90% of microchips in Russia are coming from China through these various networks of companies. Like, we should be able to like slap sectoral sanctions and secondary sanctions and make sure that these companies that are complicit in these movements, they will never ever be able to do business in the West. We are just unwilling to take that step. I mean, I know it would hurt us economically, but we are close to a war situation, and if we don't want this to be a full-blown war situation, we have to escalate to de-escalate, to use Putin's favorite turn of phrase. We just are unwilling to do that.
And I wonder if we can, it feels like particularly in Europe, but also in the United States in this administration, we have been unwilling to open our eyes and to acknowledge that the economy is not just political. And for the Europeans particularly, they've been now in a situation for at least 1 year, if not 2, ever since we have been warned by leaked or opened up US and British intelligence about China's military dual use and now military ties to Russia, that effectively China is indirectly mostly, but to some extent also directly participating in a war that is killing Europeans. The largest war that we've had on the European continent that is threatening European security overall in 70 years. And so the Europeans will not, whether we're looking in Berlin or in Bucharest or in Warsaw, are refusing to confront themselves with the reality that China is at war with them, at least partially, that it is supporting Russia's war against them, hybrid or whatever you'd like to call it. And that by letting this happen, we are again increasing the costs in the short term as well as in the long term. And we might decide that we don't want to impose tariffs because it's a cost-benefit analysis, but at least we have to talk about it publicly to explain to voters why this is a better rationale for preserving European security as well as preserving European prosperity. China is now for many years Europe's largest economic partner, and so is it the United States' economic partner. It feels hypocritical here too, and I do wonder what will it take for China's support for Russia for this reality to sink in, to maybe create a discussion, maybe after US elections in maybe Washington, maybe also in Brussels, about how we should be looking geopolitically and politically, economically at China as our partner, but also the one who is hitting us directly and indirectly.
Let us now turn to our special guest today, Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, who is a member of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine and who also served as Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration. Ivanna, among many other roles, you served as the director of the Yalta European Strategy Forum, which has held its 20th annual conference in Kiev this past weekend. You were there. Can you tell us what the mood was, given the sort of mixed news and obviously horrifying news from the front line and from many cities of Ukraine? What was the sort of mood among the domestic and international participants?
Thank you, Dalibor. Thank you for inviting, for giving me this opportunity. And yes, really, Kyiv last week was full of international guests, also because of the Crimean platform, also because of the First Ladies and Gentlemen Forum and Summit, and also because of the Yalta European Strategy annual meeting. And it gathered really representation predominantly from the Western countries and a few participants from Asian continent, but at the same time, definitely it also had a very serious Ukrainian representation. The mood was both worrisome, I think. That worry you could hear probably most strongly from many of those military people who have been present at the meeting, who have been voicing their concerns both with the need to upgrade and fasten the the weaponry deliveries, but also they were pointing out to quite a lot of additional challenges that we are facing here internally, and they were also focusing on some homework that we still have to do in order to be more efficient on the front line. Obviously, there was a lot of words of support said during this forum from many of our Western partners, including from the ministers, from former ministers, a lot of politicians, and so on. But at the same time, I think nobody got the understanding how do we get from the words to actions that are needed right now. And one of them is being to allow Ukraine to hit the Russian military targets on the Russian territory, another speeding up and amplifying the weaponry production and delivery that is needed to change the military tide in order to actually be able to think of any type of negotiations. And I think there was also, kind of a disconnect to an extent from the understanding of the Ukrainian participants on the risks that if Russia is not failing in this war, that if Russia is not defeated in this war, then the problem is not only for Ukraine, and that's not only Ukraine that will not survive or will cease to exist, but it will be a bigger tsunami wave that will hit NATO countries, European countries, and will also produce a lot of different additional conflicts across the globe with the European and transatlantic partners that predominantly would not see this risk and would be more inclined to find some solution on the middle ground that, unfortunately, from our Ukrainian perspective, will not lead to a sustainable and long-lasting peace, either here or worldwide.
Ivanna, I'd love to build a little bit further on this and connect it to something that you said earlier this year that I think is understood exactly within this disconnect very differently in Ukraine and for people in close to the border that see the proximity of the war as opposed to those further away. You said earlier this year that World War III, in fact, has already started. We touched upon this a little bit here and there on the podcast, but I'd love to take advantage of having you here, of the opportunity of having you here, to ask you to expand a little bit on this and connect it to something I was watching earlier, and that is President Zelensky's most recent interview with Fareed Zakaria on CNN, arguing that this disconnect between the view in Ukraine about how close the war is, as opposed to your European and American allies and partners that do not understand how close it is. He was making the parallel to before 2022, when for Ukrainians, especially those living further away from the front lines, the war was really far away. Is that why you're saying World War III has already started and we're not realizing this? Is that a theme that you've seen also in the past weekend? And where do you think this disconnect lies? How can we bring this closer to those in the West that are listening and that have trouble grasping it?
Yulia, I hope that President Zelensky has also made his lessons learned exercise, because he also was the one who did not believe that the war is coming in such a scale and such a scope from the Russian Federation, and didn't really want, before the full-scale invasion, to strengthen our armed forces, and was hoping that he can get some, normalized relationship with the Russian Federation. And that was a drastic mistake. I think that that's exactly why Putin decided that Ukraine is weaker, and also the West is not united enough, and the West will not act in a united manner. And so that's why he can take over Ukraine within what was it? His idea, 3 days, 10 days, whatever, or 2 weeks. And we all together have proven him wrong, because it was about the Ukrainian society that stood up to the challenge, but also the drastic and tectonic changes that have been happening at that point also in the West. And we are grateful for all those decisions that have been taken. Why do I say, and I think that many Ukrainians do understand already, that the World War III is already ongoing, but we can stop it in this phase. And that's what we have to understand, and not allow it to spill over to a much more disastrous reality, Europe-wide and worldwide, is because the Russian Federation has been preparing for this war. We disregarded the statement of Putin back in the Munich Security Conference in 2008. We didn't think that actually when he said that his major tragedy is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, and that he actually meant that he wants to restore this empire empire. And that's something that he has been working on. And he has been working on that idea of his also first using different hybrid methods of tackling Georgian society, attacking Georgia, then Ukrainian society, if you wish, Belarusian society, also in the near abroad or so-called near abroad. But also he has been developing those tools how to impact the societies in the West. And while we today are experiencing already the full-scale brutal military attack with the attempt to destroy us to the ground and just leave the burnt desert on those annexed territories that he is occupying, the others today are experiencing exactly something that we experienced some 15, 20 years ago. And that is this usage of information attacks, cyber attacks. Well, right now it has developed, cyber attacks maybe were not that popular 15, 10, 20 years ago. But also he is directly using the Russian KGB tactics of polarizing societies abroad. And that is also part of his attempt to weaken the West, to weaken from this unity, from this desire, from this understanding of what really matters and how you are dependent, your security and your prosperity, how dependent it is on readiness to actually protect the democratic principles, law, international law, rule of law principles that you declare as most important ones in order to actually preserve security and prosperity, which people are very much used to. Also, he is actually all the time trying the ground, so to say, by small military provocations. And the West continues to be showing its deep concern with regard to those military provocations, not really reacting in the way to show strength and unity and power and project some power onto the Russian Federation. He also is using the economic leverage. Everybody's in Europe is so proud of themselves with regard to giving up on buying Russian gas that is delivered by the pipelines. But everybody is shying off to acknowledge that only in 2023, 40% plus of Russian LNG gas was bought in the only countries of the European Union. So he is using all these possibilities and the interests of the countries to further divide the West, and hopes that the divided and weakened West will allow him to be more successful in his attack in one way or another. Somehow everybody disregards that he said very openly in his ultimatum in December 2021 to Biden and to Stoltenberg that he wants to restore the borders of 1997. And borders of 1997, that is pre-NATO expansion borders. That means that he has the appetite to attack the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And that's why those countries that have been part of the either Soviet Empire or have been part of the Soviet bloc, they know what he means and they see what he means and they take it for real and take it seriously, while others are still trying to judge him from the common sense and their own logic point of view, and still hope that this dictator, this criminal, can be really talked with. But I think we all have tried to talk to him. All the leaders have been trying to talk to him right before the full-scale aggression in Ukraine, when he brought the war to another level, and it didn't lead us anywhere. So I think it's time to wake up. It's time to get some sobriety in our assessment what Russia is, that this is USSR 2.0, and that we have to deal with the Russian Federation with this very same approach as the West at that point has dealt with USSR 2.0, because it is causing a threat to remnants. I cannot even say to international law, to remnants of the international law and remnants of the international security and peace that we are still, or some countries are still enjoying.
I want to take advantage of having you on the podcast as the person who probably knows more about the ins and outs of European integration and the accession process than pretty much anybody in Ukraine. So you served as the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. You now chair the Verkhovna Rada's committee that deals with EU matters and EU accession negotiations. Clearly, Ukraine has made a lot of progress, and obviously we all celebrated the granting of the candidate status, the opening of negotiations. But the consensus view, partly because of the war, is that there is still a very long road to go for Ukraine to become a full-fledged member. One of the key accession criteria that the EU uses is the so-called Copenhagen criteria for assessing the quality of democracy. And Ukraine is in a bit of a pickle because of the war situation, because of the martial law, that it can't hold elections. So there is a sort of tension between having this war situation go on for a long time, and having basically a president, a single executive making all the decisions, and entering the EU as a vibrant, full-fledged democracy. Is your sense of how the president is managing this tension? Is your sense that he is making the right calls? People have been asking questions last week about the government reshuffle, about his sort of governing style. Is this the sort of best that can be achieved in the Ukrainian context? Would you advise him to follow a different path, maybe create a government of national unity or bring in more opposition parties to have a say on governing matters? How would you sort of navigate this?
Well, definitely, the martial law is providing for a lot of restrictions, and that's logical during the wartime. And I think there is no person in Ukraine who would, for example, question the necessity of the military censorship with regard to, pointing out where the troops are moving or what military plants or factories are located where, or where those are other important infrastructural targets and so on. So this is all understandable. And also it's understandable because of the security concerns that you have limitations to the ability of people to protest or to gather, to express this or that opinion and so on. But I also think that unfortunately, right now we are seeing that some of the things are being restricted in Ukraine more than the war is providing for. And that is at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, that was done for some of the disregard of the procedures, some of the disregard of the necessary kind of steps in taking this or that decision were done because of urgency of the matter and because we didn't know how to address this or that topic. So I think there was kind of readiness and willingness to help the executive, to help the president as the person on the top of the executive to take speedy decisions. But I think that already in the third year of the full-scale invasion, not to mention that we are in the 11th year of the war, and I think that needs to be all the time reminded. People think that, wow, we reacted so bravely to what has happened on the 24th of February of 2022, but that was not the start of the war. It has been ongoing already by then for 8 years. But unfortunately, we see that the president and his team feels that they got kind of the permission to continue with ignoring some of the procedures, ignoring the role of the parliament, ignoring the necessity to engage wider networks of stakeholders to discuss of this or that decision, while I think the situation, especially because we do not have the possibility to conduct the elections, and this everybody is agreeing on, this cannot be done according to the law, this cannot be done according to the constitution, this cannot be done according to the physical inability to conduct free and fair elections and secure elections, not only the day of elections, but the campaign and so on. So I think because of this situation, we would have to change the de facto relationship within the parliament to engage more of the smaller groups that are represented in the parliament, not only the majority, not only the mono-majority, and also having this direct dialogue between the president and the government and the parliament in order to get sustainable decisions and sustainable solutions. At the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, when the Russian Federation troops were very close nearby Kyiv, I think we have had this very engaged and direct dialogue with each other, and everybody was listened to. And I think that has provided us with some additional resilience and capacity to push back. So right now we see that unfortunately the executive got used to not being under supervision and oversight and control of the parliament. And we have actually, as opposition representatives, we have fought for 2 years to get back to the parliament the questioning hours for the government. Finally, we restored them only in May of 2024. So finally, the government is coming to the parliament to answer the questions, and at least some of that oversight is gradually being restored, but that's definitely not enough. And yes, I would think we would have to review this relationships in the parliament and create a coalition of national unity, because unfortunately the majority or so-called mono-majority is not providing the necessary votes for any of the decisions. They always have to rely on support of this or that other parliamentary group, parliamentary party that are represented in the parliament, and also go into real formation of the government of national unity or national survival for this matter, I think at this point already. This is not what what's happening. We've seen the reshuffle. The reshuffle, unfortunately, was again the proof of losing the subjectivity of the parliament, because even parliamentarians from the coalition, from the majority, they have been learning about the names who are they going to suggest as a coalition the very evening before the next morning's appointment. So I don't think that this is the right way to go, especially in the light of the declared goals of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And my hope is that right now, when we are waiting for another annual enlargement report from the European Commission, that we will see in those hundreds of pages that will be describing the situation in Ukraine, a concrete list of conditionalities and steps that we'll have to address all together. And I am looking at this process after the great and important decision of opening the negotiations as a process that would give both our partners, our civil society, and those forces inside the parliament who care about democracy, about rule of law, about freedoms, about our real path towards the European and Euro-Atlantic membership, a common ground to pressure on the government and to pressure actually also on the so-called majority to return to normal practices and stop the backsliding that we've seen under the pretext of the martial law, including, some of the challenges to look for diplomatic language, some of the challenges to the freedom of speech in Ukraine, some of the challenges to continued decentralization, because what we are seeing is decentralization of powers as opposed to decentralization that has actually proven the ability of people to push back on the aggressor, and also were part of our capacity to be stronger at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion.
Ivanna, thank you so much. Julia and I still have a host of other questions related to EU matters, and we have to have you back to take a deeper dive into the progress achieved and the next steps. But for now, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and joining us here on the Eastern Front.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Dalibor.
Finally, it's time for our recommendations. I have one article in mind that I would like our listeners to take a look at. It came out in the Wall Street Journal on the 14th of September. The title is "Europe Has a Painful Choice, War versus Welfare." And it speaks to one of my favorite subject matters, namely this question of fiscal choices made by Western and European countries. Obviously, people are alarmed about Russian threat to Europe's security, but they're not always behaving that way. And the reality is that in a world of high debt burdens, we have to choose between guns and butter, so to speak. And the revealed preference by many Europeans is that they just want to be cozy and complacent and stick with their generous welfare schemes at the expense of investing into security. I don't think that the EU necessarily provides an answer. I mean, there are lots of calls, including from Draghi report, for greater fiscal capacity at the EU level. The reality, though, is that if you have these debt burdens close to 100% of GDP, in many cases exceeding 100% of GDP, you're not going to solve the economic problem by adding another layer of debt. I mean, you just have to consolidate public finances at a national level and make sure that your entitlements are sustainable and that you have the space to invest into your defenses. And none of that is happening. So the article notes that once the Zeitenwende fund expires, Germany will be again well below 2% of GDP in terms of defense spending, and unlikely to exceed it. I mean, there aren't really explicit plans to get it further up. That is worrying, and it's worrying from a political perspective more than anything else. So I don't want to make a plug for my own work, but I made the argument in Foreign Policy magazine last week for why Germany should not occupy the central role in American geopolitical imagination that it currently does, as a sort of proxy for Europe and as being our first point of contact in Europe. But the politics of transatlantic relations as they exist in Washington make Germany the central piece. So the fact that the Germans are really unwilling to sort of step up and play that role just bodes ill for the future of the transatlantic relationship. And for us, we can make the argument that the US has to remain engaged in Europe no matter what the Germans do, and I think that's the right argument. But it just tends to land on deaf ears in some quarters, and it's harder to make if Germans are just so openly, dismissive of the need to do more, spend more, and also make different fiscal choices. Julia, you're the Germany expert here. Feel free to weigh in.
I'm the Germany expert, but I'm not the finance expert. I do agree that this is a problem because it solidifies Germany's geo-economic role, if you'd like, in Europe. And that's undeniable because Germany's economy is so much larger than all the others, and that Germany has been working very hard in a bipartisan way ever since before the financial crisis in 2009 to become this go-to voice, right? And then you see this pickup historically of we will take on more responsibility based on the pressure of our allies and partners in security in 2014 with the Munich Consensus at the Munich Security Conference. But this has translated into indeed Germany taking leadership in the form of when it comes to security migration. We can discuss that in a different context, but that has financial implications, massive ones too, and has been undermining in 2015 EU migration law. So it does point to double standards and most prominently Minsk I and Minsk II as European leadership provided by Germany when it comes to security. We haven't been able to divorce Germany from that. Germany has been dragging its feet when it comes to actually providing hard security for Europe, but no European power other than Germany is coming close to competing with Germany when it comes to economics. So it's a conundrum that I acknowledge, but I don't know what to do about it, particularly when it comes to finance. So Dalibor, you have the last word here.
I think we'll have to leave it at this and leave our listeners in suspense until we resolve the issue in the next episode. Thank you for listening to the Eastern Front, a podcast on the security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter, LinkedIn and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics you'd like us to cover. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider rating, reviewing and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.